Hey guys, welcome back to Fitting for Apparel Design. We're in section 3 and we're going to be talking about how construction affects the fit of your garment. So this section is going to be a lot shorter than the last two. We had so much information to fit in those last two sections, and the next section is going to be another really long one. But I really wanted to highlight construction kind of as its own category, just because it's something really important to keep in mind when you're fitting your garment. If you're just joining us in Fitting for Apparel Design, I highly recommend that you go watch the first two videos. And just another overarching sort of apology for the interruptions. I'm in the middle of moving my studio, and so we are hanging out here in my living room, and my dog, if you can see her in the camera, she may be hopping in and out. So apologies for the distractions, but let's get into how construction impacts the fit of your garment. So if you've been following along with me for a while, you have probably already seen some posts about what the production process looks like and kind of what you can expect when you get your sample in for the first time. So what are we referencing when we're talking about construction? This is pretty much everything beyond like the pattern and specs that we talk about earlier in the series. So it's going to be the stitching, how the pockets are constructed, all of that information is kind of what we're going to be focusing on today. We'll also be talking about how special details and finishes and fabric tie into construction that can impact the fit of your garment. If you haven't read it or watched it already, I highly recommend checking out my tutorial, How to Review a Prototype Sample. That is going to kind of give you the foundation to understand what we're talking about today. So I'm not going to get into all of those details, but I definitely recommend it, especially before we go on to section 4, which will be next week, where we will be talking about fitting. So it'll be really important to kind of understand how to review your sample, because that's the first step before you get into fitting your garment. Once you've checked out that tutorial, you'll understand how important it is to review the specs of your garment and review all of the details so that you can really determine what is affecting the fit and the overall design of your garment. When you're trying to determine if an issue is caused by construction, the biggest piece of advice I can give to you is to always, always, always request the pattern along with your prototype sample. So typically your factory will send you your garment sample back, and in some cases they may have checked the specs for you as well, which I also recommend. But you may have to actually request the pattern to come with your sample. And the importance of that is so that you can compare the pattern shapes to your garment sample. And that's how you'll be able to determine if the sewing and construction of the garment has affected the pattern shapes in any way. If you don't have your pattern, you won't be able to determine if construction, in a lot of cases, is the culprit of your fit issues. As I talked about in section 1 of this series, the pattern is the foundation for your garment, so it's also super helpful in a lot of different ways for communicating with your factory and requesting design changes. If you're noticing a fit issue and the pattern does not reflect what the sample looks like by comparing them one on top of the other, then you know that the issue is either from cutting the pattern pieces out or it's from construction of the garment. I also just want to highlight that in production, your fabric will be cut flat. And what you're probably used to seeing, especially if you do any home sewing, is that your garment pattern pieces are cut from the fabric on the fold. So this can cause the garment to have issues on one side and not on the other. Whereas in home sewing, typically, if you're cutting your pattern out correctly on the fold, then your two sides are going to be exactly the same. So just an FYI, if you're seeing something on one side and not the other side of your garment, then it may be a cutting issue. In some cases, your sample may reflect the correct specs, but still not be fitting the way that you intended it to. And that is where the pattern shapes really come into play, because your garment can measure the correct specs, but the pattern shapes can be off and cause a lot of fit issues. And that's why it's so important to review your sample specs as well as going over the sample for construction and all of those little details. When you're reviewing your sample, you'll want to pay close attention to the construction details that you've provided to the factory for how to create your garment. In some cases, you may need to redesign some of the construction that you've requested because it's just not working with the garment. One example of this could be a neckline that is kind of gaping, and that could be due to the binding construction that you've requested from the factory. So it's not always that the seamstress has not constructed your garment correctly, but it's about what you're requesting from your factory. So it's important to pay attention to those details and be open to changing them to something that's going to work better. There are a few areas that I recommend paying close attention to when you're trying to determine if construction is the culprit of your fit issues. The areas that I recommend paying close attention to are the thread tension, the cutting, so the pattern shapes that are being cut out, joining of the seams, so that can affect the pattern shapes, or it can even cause some bubbling or puckering. The fabric, because if the weights are not matching, then it can cause pulling or drooping of the two fabrics that are meeting, the lining of the garment, and the order in which the garment is sewn. Here are some common fit issues that you may see that are the culprit of poor construction. The first one being that the armhole drop is off, and that can be from joining the underarm and side seam all at one time. So from the bottom hem to the sleeve hem. And this is a common construction that you'll see in fast fashion or cheaply made ready to wear, because it's a much easier and faster way to join that seam in comparison to setting in the sleeve. Another issue that you may see is that the pattern shapes don't match the sample, and this can be for two reasons. The first one being what we talked about earlier, that maybe the pattern pieces weren't cut out exactly correctly, and the second one being that the seamstress may have not followed the sewing lines close enough. So oftentimes that will happen when serging, because the serger is joining, covering the seam allowance and cutting off the excess seam allowance all at the same time. And so sometimes those corners or those curves can get cut a little bit too much or not enough. This is especially an issue in landmark areas like the bust. If your seams are puckering, then that means that the thread tension is too tight on the machine, and you can also see the opposite, that the thread tension is not tight enough. If you're seeing the seam buckle or pucker or pull, then that can be due to the pattern pieces not being lined up quite correctly when they go into the sewing machine, and it can also be due to the fabric weight. So if you're using two different fabrics in your sample, when they're joined into a seam, if one is a really, really light fabric and one's a really dense fabric, then the fabric weights aren't matching close enough. And the way to fix this is to add stability with interfacing, or you can choose a different fabric altogether. And the final common issue that you may see is that the fashion fabric seems like it's caught up on something, and this is usually due to the lining or pocket lining being constructed incorrectly, too short, too long, and doesn't quite match the fashion fabric close enough, and it's therefore pulling in the direction that it's caught up in. So as you guys saw in section 1 and section 2, I am releasing the fitting DIY kit at the very end of this series. And if you're kind of wondering why you're having certain fit issues, how to fix them, how to determine what is what, I will be including a ebook guide inside of that fitting kit that will go through common fit issues and how to fix them. It also has a bunch of other great resources like digital rulers, and it also comes with a nested grade of blocks along with a size chart, and you can choose between men's and ladies or a combination of both. And just a reminder, if you're a subscriber to my email list, you'll be getting a 20% discount straight to your inbox. So if you want to sign up, I will definitely leave that link down below. So there you go, that's how you can determine if construction is the culprit of the fit issues in your garment. I know this section was a little bit shorter, but get ready for next week because that is going to be full of so much information, and we're finally getting into how to fit your garment and really going into fit sessions and sort of all of the information that you'll need to know to hold your very own fit session and properly fit your garment. So if you enjoyed this tutorial, please like, subscribe, comment, and share. You can always reach out to me with any comments or questions that you have, and I'll see you guys next week.
Bye.